Hello, and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy. I am your host, Jeremy Schumacher, licensed marriage and family therapist. We're back with another special guest episode. This is maybe my most removed from therapy special guest so far that I'm very excited to talk about mental health with. Today, I have Harvey and Eisner Award winning comic book writer, Jason Aaron. Jason, thanks for coming on.
Sure. Thanks for having me. And I don't think I'm not that far removed from therapy.
I've had nutritionists on, I've had sex educators on. Everybody's kind of been like therapy adjacent.
Oh, gotcha. Well, I mean, I think writing comics for me is very therapeutic. So does that count?
Yeah. And I'm super excited to talk about some of the mental health. I mean, one of my specialties is religious trauma, which I think is a huge theme in some of your writing. So yeah, therapy adjacent. I know going to the comic shop is a very therapeutic experience for a lot of people.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is Wednesday when we're talking, so I'm gonna have to get to the comic book store probably as soon as we're done. I haven't been today.
Yeah. Once Upon a Time at the End of the World should have is that, well, comics come
I
out on
think
Wednesday for people who aren't in the know, but
right. Yeah, I think that the new issue that came out last week, I think. I'm not
yeah,
sure what comes out
I'm
this week.
I'm
Yeah.
a trade paperback person. I know that's not
Oh, gotcha.
popular in comic purists, but I have a hard time keeping track of what comes out when, so I just get the collected editions.
Sure. I mean, as a longtime comic book reader and as somebody who's made their living from writing comics for years now, I don't begrudge anyone for how they choose to
Yeah,
indulge the habit, whether you buy comics or trades or read them digitally. Like, as long as you read the stories and enjoy them, that's the most important part.
for sure. So let's start. I always start with how'd you get into the profession? You have kind of an interesting story with writing comics in that you won a contest search.
Yeah, I mean, writing comics was really what I wanted to do since I was a kid. I remember saying at a really young age that once I kind of realized, like, oh, people, do this, people make these things. Um, like I said pretty quickly, I want to do that. And I loved to draw as a kid. I don't know if but I can't remember. Maybe I wanted to be Frank Miller and, write and draw my own comics. I didn't really stick with the drawing part of it, but yeah, I've loved to write my whole life, so I kind of knew I always wanted to do that. And it's just when I got of age, I had absolutely no idea how to go about breaking into comics. And I grew up in a small town in Alabama, and back in those days, there really was no way other than living in New York, which was very much the heart of comic book publishing. So I felt as about as far from New York City as you could get. So continued to pursue writing in different ways. Got an English degree and wrote short stories and film reviews and that sort of thing. And then Marvel Comics in the summer of 2000 did this talent search contest, which was a weird thing that sort of came out of the blue. I remember it was sort of controversial at the time because some of the veteran writers working for him were saying, why you casting a net for people who've never written anything. But they kind of did it. It was at San Diego Comic-Con and at Wizard World Chicago, so you had to be there in person to apply. And I typed up a one-page synopsis for a Wolverine story and dropped it on a huge stack of them. And it was months later before I had a voicemail message on my phone from an editor at Marvel telling me I won, and that was 2001.
Yeah. Which is a weird way to get into a career, right? Like to win a contest like that's not the recommended course of action.
Yeah, I mean it's weird in that they've never done anything like that since then. So it was kind of. I mean, I feel like breaking into comics is always difficult. I think it's easier now than it has been, but still it's challenging just to kind of get your foot in the door and get somebody's attention. So I think there's always a matter of luck involved. Like you get lucky in terms of the situation or connection with someone who can help you out or whatever. But it's not just luck. You kind of have to be prepared. So when that moment arises, that you take advantage of it. And I think I'd spent literally, you know, pretty much most all of my conscious life up until that point writing, thinking about stories, making up stories in my head, reading comics, working on my own comics, like everything I had done to kind of build and prepare for that moment. When it came along, I was able to take advantage of it and get my foot in the door.
Sure. What was it like? I mean, you say that you want to do this since you were a little kid. I think it's rare for people to know what they want to do as kids and then translate it into a career. Like, was this something your family was supportive of, or did you get the like, hey, maybe a real job or a real career would be a good idea?
Yeah, that was definitely my dad's perspective because it was very, it was like me saying I wanted to go to Mars to him. It was like, um, it seemed wholly unrealistic, but he was being practical. I mean, he encouraged me to be a lawyer, to go to law school, which I would have been a terrible lawyer. Um, but my mom was the one who, who bought me those first comics I read, took me to the wherever there was a spinner rack or a comic book store, took me to my first comic book convention. So she kind of always encouraged me to do whatever, to pursue whatever I thought I wanted to do. And I think for me, I mean, I just knew something clicked with it pretty early on when I was a kid, just the act of writing. I've always been quiet and especially in my younger days is pretty painfully shy and just the struggle to kind of communicate my thoughts to the outside world and writing was really the way I could do that. I couldn't say things with my mouth to people, but I could put anything in words on paper. So it
Sure.
was just something early on just felt right for me. It felt like kind of okay, like when you find something that's a fundamental piece of who you are, and that you didn't know that until you just stumbled upon it.
Yeah. What was it like? You went to University of Alabama, Birmingham, so big school for a English degree. Like, were you vocal about I want to write comics? Like that's why I'm here, or was that just like, we'll see what happens with writing and what that turns into?
Yeah, I mean, I really, again, I didn't know how to even do the comic part of it. I was still reading never quit reading comics, always reading and loving comics, and I just wanted to write. So I started at the University of Alabama as a journalism major, and then pretty quickly realized I didn't like that and dropped out for a few years, and eventually went back to UAB and got an English degree, which still, I didn't really know like what am I going to do with this when I graduate. I wasn't really thinking about that. I enjoyed the classes I took at UAB. I took lots of fiction writing classes, which were great, and that for the first time I was getting feedback from people I didn't know, people who weren't my friends. Um, and it took a lot of different literature classes, so it got me to kind of read outside my comfort zone for the first time and just sort of read things I maybe wouldn't have picked up otherwise. So I think even though once I graduate, I was like, okay, well, what the hell do I do now? And had no idea, and nobody's ever when you break it into comics, nobody's ever asking to see your diploma or
Sure.
what classes you took in college. But I think the reading and the writing I did in at UAB was hugely helpful, I think, to my development as a writer.
Yeah. You have some literary references throughout your work. Were you a voracious reader growing up, or was that kind of like that formal education of like, hey, like here's some classic authors, read their works? Was that part of your upbringing?
No, I mean, I definitely loved to read growing up, and kind of read a little bit of everything. Not just comics, not just Robert E. Howard Conan books or fantasy or science fiction. Like, kind of read a little bit of everything. Um, And then, yeah, when I got to college, I read Faulkner for the first time. I developed a big appreciation for Mark Twain, who I'd kind of always dismissed up until that point. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think I kind of always had that where I love to read, which I think in my experience pretty much always goes hand in hand with somebody who loves to write. I don't know that I love anyone who enjoys writing who doesn't also, you know, love to read. Um,
Sure.
and the only person I knew growing up who wrote for a living was my cousin Gus Hasford, who was a Vietnam vet and a novelist. His book, The Short Timers, is what Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket is based on. And Gus, of course, was much older than me. And only met him in person, I think, 3 times in my life. But he was, fascinating to me in that he came from where I came from. Um, and it, I mean, I saw him as this very, exotic, like idealized figure that he traveled the globe and had this massive book collection. He was a bit of a eccentric in that he was, like living in flop houses part of the time, and hundreds of his books were stolen from libraries across the country. But as a kid, I thought he was the most amazing figure ever, and he was an incredible writer and a guy who just absolutely like the epitome of when you say a voracious reader, like a man who could talk at length on just sort of any number of subjects and just constantly reading. Um, so I think I kind of all I think I saw like that's what you're supposed to be if you want to be a writer, and I think I always felt that that the writing and reading were two things that I love to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I have all these titles you've worked on. I mean, a lot of big names over at Marvel. You were there for 15 years. You just recently announced you'd be writing Batman, Off-World, some creator-owned stuff thrown in there that we'll talk about too. But like wanting to write comics, did you expect you would have this list of Thor and Wolverine and Punisher and Avengers? Like, was that always the goal, or that was like, we'll see what happens when I get there?
No, I can't say that that was ever the goal or ever imagined that or thought that. Um, and it's always like it's never gotten old. Like I've um, just in the last few months, like you said, I'm starting to do things for DC for the first time. So some of the characters I've gotten to write, I mean, it feels like I'm a kid starting out, breaking in for the first time, like getting to put words in the mouth of these characters that I've grown up reading. That part has never gotten old.
Sure.
But no, I never expected that, never thought that. I mean, excuse me, um, grew up loving superhero comics. I kind of started reading in the mid '80s when you had this explosion of smaller publishers. So I was reading Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and American Flag and all those early Dark Horse
Sure.
books like Concrete and Black Cross, and so a lot of different genres outside of superheroes. And it was a great time for a kid to get into comics. I think as a reader, I mean, as a creator, I've sort of always been the same, where I'm attracted to a lot of different kinds of characters and genres and such. So I think breaking in, when I started breaking in, I kind of quickly figured out that it didn't make a lot of sense to just chase after specific characters. Like, well, I love
Hmm.
Spider-Man, so I just want to write Spider-Man. So let me chase after Spider-Man and pitch Spider-Man. Like I realized it made more sense to focus on the real, like, flesh and blood people involved with the situation, and like, okay, I read a lot of books that this one particular editor edits, so chances are he and I probably have pretty similar sensibilities, so I should try to work with him. And
Sure.
that proved much more beneficial to me. So it became less about, you know, like what character did I was I a fan of as a child, but what characters is this editor editing do I have a story I can tell with those characters? So, you know, I was always a bigger DC reader as a kid than Marvel, so um, I liked Wolverine, but didn't have I would say a a huge knowledge of Wolverine. And then I wrote Wolverine stories for like 7 years. And Thor,
Yeah,
I had barely read any Thor. I mean, I read the Walt Simonson stuff as a kid, but Thor came along at the right time and felt to me like I could kind of see what my version of Thor I thought looked like, and had a story I wanted to tell, and then I wrote 100 issues of Thor. So I think I've always kind of looked at it as like what feels right in the moment. What situation feels right more than just, well, I really just want to write Batman.
sure.
But
When
now I'm also just getting to write Batman, so that feels good too.
Yeah, that is cool. Uh, with some of these characters that you maybe have less or had less familiarity with, do you go back and read what's been written before and other artists have done, or is it something where Marvel says, "Hey, like this is off limits," or "This is what we imagine"? Like, how much of it is you pitching this idea for a story you want to write versus trying to make sure you're staying within, like, for established characters like that?
I mean, it depends. The things vary project to project and have varied over the course of my career. I mean, um, with the Wolverine stuff, I mean, there was like one of my first Wolverine stories was with editor Axel Alonso, and he kind of gave me a setup for, okay, like, do Wolverine's trapped in this pit and they keep shooting him with machine guns, and how does he get out? And that was kind of the challenge of just figure out a story that gets him out of that pit. And sometimes I'd get a call saying, hey, well, we're doing this secret invasion book. Do you want to write a few issues of Black Panther where Skrulls invade Wakanda? And I'm like, sure. So you get
Yeah,
sort of a setup or an idea, and then you figure it out from there. But most of the stuff I've done is just me saying, hey, I want to do this with Thor. I want to do this with the Avengers or whatever. So
yeah,
um, I think especially once you're there for a little while, like you kind of earn a certain level of trust,
sure.
and um, so I mean, for the most part of my time at Marvel, I was working with a pretty small group of people, getting notes from a small group of people, and kind of you know getting to do the stories that I wanted to tell.
Yeah. So writing 100 issues of Thor, across, 7-ish years. Um, One of the basis for the MCU movies, like what what was kind of your idea as far as like introducing a character like Gore the God Butcher? Was that something that you wanted to write? Thor's not worthy to pick up the hammer. That's the story I want to tell, or was it, hey, I want to talk about gods and belief, or like how does that kind of come together for you as somebody who's talking about some of these themes?
Well, I mean, I think it goes back to this will answer. I forgot to answer the other part of your previous question. You asked about going back and reading old stories for those characters, and that's absolutely what I did with Thor. Like I said, I had not read that many Thor comics. Had an idea for what I wanted to do, but I'd never read any of the original Stan Lee, Larry Lieber, Jack Kirby issues of Thor. So I went back and read all those, and now it's some of my favorite Kirby stuff. Is a big chunk of that Thor run, and so I think just reading those stories of what makes this character interesting, what are the core parts of his mythology that have been there since the very beginning, what set him apart right out of the get go. And one of the things Stan Lee said was, that's the reason we did Thor's. It was the idea of doing Super God, right? Like, how's this guy different from Iron Man and Captain America and Spider Man and everybody else? Well, he's powerful, but how he's different is that he's a god. And I liked that idea, um, especially at a time when the movies were sort of leaning in another direction, where it's like, well, these characters are really just kind of other dimensional aliens that primitive people perceived as gods, right? But they're not really gods. And so I wanted to lean hard in the opposite direction in the original ideas that no, that like these are gods. And so what does that mean? What does that mean for Thor to be a god in the Marvel universe? And I wanted to explore all the aspects of that from, well, it means he kind of walks a beat and goes to these different realms that no other Marvel characters go to, right? It means he's been alive for so much longer than other
Hmm.
Marvel heroes, and is going to continue to be alive long after everybody else is dead. And it means his hammer, the kind of the really first fundamental part of the Thor mythology was about his hammer and this promise that if you were worthy, you could pick it up and gain the powers of Thor. That What does that mean? What does that mean to be for a god to be worthy? So I think all those ideas pretty quickly formed as like, well, these are going to be the core fundamental parts of everything I do, and they were really for, like you said, 7 years and 100 issues. I always came back to those ideas, and I think as part of that, as the part of exploring like what does it mean to be a god in the Marvel universe, I knew I wanted to have a villain who kind of represented the dark side of that, of the failings of gods in the Marvel U, and someone who said these, gods are terrible. Like we'd be better off without them. Um, they don't care about us. Like they're fighting with each other all the time, which Marvel history had pretty much shown us.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
I mean, one of my favorite Kirby villains is the Man-Gog, who was created. He was born of the rage of a billion beings that Odin had slaughtered, which is such a great idea, and is another character I knew right away I was going to use. So, I mean, the I don't think I made up the idea that Marvel gods were terrible, generally terrible.
Sure.
That had
Yeah.
been pretty firmly established. And that's what makes Thor special. Thor's not just special because he's a god, because there's lots of gods in the Marvel pantheon, right? Like lots and lots of them. But Thor is even special among them. So what makes him special? Um, and that was the the core question I used to write those 100 issues. Really,
Hmm. And so was Gore kind of because Gore was a character that stood out for me a lot. I think I was raised evangelical, and it took me a long time to leave the church to the point now where I work with religious trauma and out and out atheist and advocate for that. I think it's one of those things where this character who's saying gods aren't worthy and like we shouldn't be worshiping them, we'd be better off without them. Like that's a I don't know. I would say like kind of a provocative take. Like that's something that he as a villain was one of those characters. It's like, oh well, you can kind of see where he's coming from. You see his kids, his family die, and like his questioning of the gods, and nothing's answered. So like there's sympathy there, but then his response is so over the top.
right? Well, yeah. I mean, I think to me, some of the best villains are those where you can understand where they're coming from to some degree, and you can even sympathize with what sets them down that path, and then they just take it to really horrible lengths. So
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, I think you can absolutely would sympathize with Gore, where he grew up in this world where um, there was constant suffering, and people sort of spent their lives worshiping these gods who never showed up, never came to help them, never seemed to do anything for their benefit. And Gore got to the point where he's like, there are no gods. Like, I don't believe it. Like, there's nothing, there's no evidence that anybody up there is listening to our prayers. And then he sees that, oh yeah, there are gods when they fall to earth, where two gods have been fighting each other. And then that makes him even angrier. So yeah, they are up there. They just don't care about us. They're busy fighting amongst themselves. And that from that moment he sort of bonds with this dark weapon, and that sets him down the path where he's like, well, I'm going to find them and kill them all. um, so I wanted a villain that could speak to the different aspects of what made Thor special. So the idea of Gore being a villain that he would fight across thousands and thousands of years, in different eras of his life as a young god of the Vikings and as a present day Avenger, and then in the far, far future as this like old withered King Thor.
Hmm.
And then I also wanted to do something that I wanted like a dark Kirby feel to the book, so I wanted to do like dark cosmic mixed with kind of horror elements. So I like the idea of um, a serial killer of gods, basically, is what Gore starts as, and then kind of evolves and gets bigger and bigger as he goes. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot. I always caution fans who get mad about something a character says and equate those words or thoughts to the writer. That's a dangerous thing to. I used to get X-Men fans who would be mad at me because they said I hated Cyclops, and I'm like, I don't hate Cyclops. Wolverine hates Cyclops, and I'm writing
Right.
Wolverine. Um, so I never want characters I write to just sound like me, like they're speaking with my voice or saying things I say. I have delighted in the fact that over the course of my career, I have been at times criticized by people for being too Christian in my stories,
Hmm.
and at other times criticized for being too blasphemous or satanic or what. Both ends of the spectrum, which gives me
Yeah.
an immense amount of joy because I want it to be about whatever the story is and whatever the characters are saying. But all that said, there are definitely moments. I think the closest I have come to kind of putting my own words and beliefs into the mouths of a character are one of the scenes in Thor: God of Thunder where Gore's son is talking to young Thor and sort of gives him this speech about like, don't you see how we would all be better off without you if you just didn't exist? And I think
Hmm.
that's definitely like me as an atheist, peeking through a bit in that moment. Which again, I try not to do too much, but I couldn't resist there.
Sure. Yeah. And you were raised in the South, so in the Bible Belt, like, was um church a big part of your upbringing? Was that something that you were exposed to in your family, or was it just kind of like that cultural? I mean, from the Bible Belt, that's a big Southern Baptist type part of the country.
Yeah, it was a big part. I grew up in the church, grew up Southern Baptist. Was got saved when I was a teenager at a church youth retreat in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, I believe it was. So very, very much, it is such a integral part of small town Southern life of like, that's what you do. You go to church on Sunday morning and Sunday night and Wednesday night. And it was
Yeah.
a big part of just life and social circles and all that stuff. But I also very much believe, like I very much, um, I would say faith was, I don't know if I can ever say my faith was a huge, really core part of my life. I think I probably would have told you it was, but then when I would meet people where it absolutely was in a big part of their life, I could tell, well, I don't think I have that. I don't think I have
Sure.
what that person has. I think faith never felt as fundamental to who I was as writing did. Right. I think that was the part that clicked for me. And faith, I definitely um, clung to and looked at as like didn't question it for a long time.
Hmm.
Um, but I think kind of as I got older, once I started college, like just there started to be chinks in the armor, I guess, of just things. I started to question things here and there, and then I remember like having a argument with my father at some point where I don't even remember specifically like what we were talking about, or what point we were arguing about. But something related to the Bible or just Christianity in general. And he got kind of flustered with me, and he said, "Well, if you don't believe this part, then I don't know why you believe any of it." And a light bulb went off over my head, and I was like, "I think you're right. I think I don't."
Hmm.
Um, and I've kind of never looked back. Like I started considered myself an atheist kind of in my early 20s, and I'm 50 now, so that's how I've identified for most of my life at this point. And it's there's been no great hole left in my life since the faith part
Sure.
went away. I've been able to pursue a happy and healthy life, and I feel like if anything, um, atheism has just helped me narrow down over the years on who I am and what I believe and what is important to me and what feels sacred to me. Like
Hmm.
you can still have things that are sacred even if there's no religious connotations involved. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, sorry, I guess I got off track from what the question was, but
No, that's that's good. That's so much what I talk about, and why I love. Uh, I like to give clients I work with, like, I'd rather recommend, hey, check out this comic book or read this story or watch this show that deals with the topic than give them a textbook on it. And so I
sure,
love when there's pop culture, and I love when there are stories that capture some of those things. If we can look at something like Thor and say, what does belief look like? Or what does that mean to believe in something? Or is worthiness as a topic? Like, those are really,
right,
I think they can be explored so differently through fiction or through characters that don't have to be beholden to factual information.
sure. Well, I mean, I will say, all given all that I just said about being an atheist for my entire comic book writing career, um, I think it's since I kind of lost my faith. If anything, I have become more interested in and fascinated by the stories of religion, even than I was before, just as stories, and also just in ideas of fate. And I think that's littered throughout my writing career. That we talked about how when I won the Marvel Comics Talent Search contest, so the pitch for the story, the Wolverine story that got my foot in the door in comics was very much influenced by Flannery O'Connor's "A Good Man Is Hard to Find." So it's Wolverine kind of stumbles out of the woods and encounters this lady who's got a flat tire, on this dirt road in the middle of nowhere. And while he's helping her, clearly trying to get her out of there, they have a conversation about fate. Um,
Hmm.
and so, kind of right away, like started exploring the idea of Wolverine and the question of fate. And that I was told at the time that helped my story stand out because I was one of the only ones that didn't have Wolverine, fighting ninjas in a bar. Um,
Sure.
and then as I proceeded to write Wolverine for the next 6 7 years, I constantly came back to that idea. Like one of my favorite issues I wrote was sort of the last will and testament of Nightcrawler, when Nightcrawler died in one of the other X-Men books, and he and Wolverine had been close friends for so long, and Nightcrawler was a man of deep religious faith, and it's sort of like what the thing he asks of Wolverine after he dies, and what Wolverine does to try to make that happen, and then um, Wolverine goes to hell at one point. Like I did a big Wolverine goes to hell storyline, so I kind of always came back to that, despite being a pretty staunch atheist. And I've continued to write stories about faith and stories about the Bible and all the things I kind of grew up with.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well,
Spoilers, yeah, spoilers.
is it,
Um,
do you have a rule as a comic book writer for when the
I don't know.
spoilers come out?
No.
It's
I mean,
seven years
it
ago.
was a secret. Original Sin was an event miniseries I wrote, and there's a moment I always liked the idea of a character who could, you know, um, devastate someone with just a word, a whisper. I think I
Sure.
there's that scene in um, Silence of the Lambs, where they mention that Hannibal Lecter had made the guy in the cell next door to him kill himself just by whispering to him in the night, which I thought was one of the most terrifying parts of that, just that kind of power. So I was always fascinated by that. So in the original sin, Nick Fury is empowered and he whispers something to Thor, and Thor drops his hammer and can't pick it up again. And it was a question for years as to what was said, and that I'd learned. I did a whisper in a previous issue of Punisher, and in that we lettered the actual words and then just shrunk them down really small. And I realized
Yeah.
there's no amount you can shrink it down where someone can't blow it up and read it. So with the original
Yeah.
Sin book, I made sure that it's just gibberish. Like, put gibberish in there. I don't want people to cheat and know what was actually said. So for years it was a question, and I didn't tell anybody. I think I maybe told Will Moss, my editor, pretty early on, but and my original thought was kind of longer. It was like a few sentences, because I've still got my Thor notebook here, and it was all written down.
Sure.
So I knew what it was. I knew the gist of it. But we didn't reveal that for years. And then by the time we got there, I just kind of boiled it down to those 3 words. So it was. I think some people thought it would be some shocking realization, and it's a very
Yeah.
simple phrase, but it's the what it means, for Thor, because it's telling him his worst fear, the thing that he's afraid is true. Um,
Right.
so yeah.
Yeah. I laughed about the Punisher thing because I hadn't read those Punisher Max issues, and then once you and I had emailed a little bit and corresponded to set this up, I found them at a comic shop and picked them up, and 100%. I just zoomed in on my phone until I could read what was written there. So that was funny that you said, "Oh, I learned my lesson there." Like, yeah,
Right.
I
Yeah,
think
no, I'm super proud of those Punisher issues too. The Punisher Max book I got to do with the late Steve Dillon. Like, I'm really, really proud of that. It's very dark and very demented, but it was a lot of fun.
yeah. Uh, I think kind of this idea of belief and meaning making, what gives lives meaning, was really present in Scalped too. Like, Dash is kind of fighting everybody else's idea of fate or what he's supposed to be doing throughout that series. And some of it's the FBI, but some of it is his family. Some of it is other people saying, like, well, you could lead the tribe. And so there are all these things that are kind of pressing on him that he's like, I don't want that. Like, that's not what is important to me.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I loved writing the characters of Scalp so much, and I looked at, I think the book kind of changed and grew as it went along, and it definitely started out as totally Dash's story with Red Crow as the villain, and I was still the basic structure of it. But as it went along, Red Crow would get much more sympathetic, I think, than Dash some of the times. And
Mhm.
Dash would go down some really dark roads. So I was just trying to lean into the film noir of it all, and sort of the James Elroy of it, to where these are two really deeply flawed men, flawed in different ways, and even at times when they realize their flaws and they know what they are, they still can't help but get caught up in them and get derailed by them, and go down roads of regret. And so Scalped was really 60 issues of those two guys, button heads and chasing after each other in different ways.
Yeah. I mean, being from small town Alabama, what was it like to write life on an Indian reservation? What was it? I mean, a fictional version of one, but what was that research? Was that just, I want a Western story, I want some noir thrown in, or was that, let me be careful and let me really dig into what the experience is? Because there's so many things that I think are accurate in that depiction with drugs and alcohol and some of the intergenerational poverty and trauma that goes into those living spaces. So, what was that like for you to kind of build a fictional world of a very real place?
I mean, I think it was everything you just said. I mean, on it was, it seemed like the perfect setting for the kind of book I wanted to do. And also it represented a story, that we had never seen before, right? Like, nobody had ever done a Native American noir, modern day, noir like that I'd ever seen. So it seemed very, um, ripe to do those kind of stories. And yes, I absolutely wanted to be, respectful of it's a fictional reservation, but it's clearly, um, you know, thinly veiled version of a couple of real places. So, um, tried to, did as much research as I could, talk to people, especially as the book started going, as the book got a lot of native fans. I had people writing to me who became good resources. Um,
Mhm.
and to me, regardless of whatever kind of story you're writing, um, whatever the challenge is like that, it's got to kind of start and end with the characters. Who are these characters? How do are they, do they feel like real people? Are they just stereotypes? Are they thinly veiled? If they are, it kind of falls apart no matter what the setting of the story is, right? And I pretty quickly on Scalped, I mean, I wanted to lean into the characters. I knew if, there was, I mean, I was a brand new writer. Gara, who was drawing it, was a brand new artist. A Native American crime drama was not really something that you thought would tear up the sales chart. So the deck was kind of stacked against the book from the get go of like, is this even going to work? Are we going to get 12 issues? So I knew right away, like, look, if people are going to like this book, it's not be going to be because we dazzle them with plots. The plots of this series are basically stories we've seen before. And with the same sort of film noir stuff, where at times what's coming, like you see the light of the train in that tunnel. Um, so it's not going to be like shocks and twists and high concept stuff. It's about, do you like these characters? Are you interested in these characters? So the second arc we did of the book, really each issue focused on a different character, which seemed like a strange choice at the time when we had just started, and it's like you don't even know who these people are yet. But I knew if we don't hook people on the characters right away, we're not going to last. We're not going to be around long. And we did. That was the thing that people really responded to, and we got we got to do 60 plus issues of that book, which I don't think anybody would have bet money on when we started. And even as it went along, that we were kind of one of the last Vertigo books to really have a long run like that, and that there was a long history of books like that before us. But the days of Vertigo were kind of, we were closer to the end when Scalp started than we were at the beginning. So we kind of snuck in, in those last days, and that was very much the book that really gave me a comic book career. Even though I had broken in with that Marvel Talent Search contest, Scalped was kind of the first thing that you know started to bring me some attention and acclaim, and got me
Mhm.
more work.
Yeah. And I think I read this somewhere, if I remember correctly, you signed with Marvel then while you were still working on Scalps.
Yeah, I signed with Marvel, I think in 2008. So Scalped had been
Mhm.
going. I think Scalped started in 2006. So yeah, I worked on Scalped for a few more years.
Yeah.
After once I was exclusive to Marvel.
One of the other, character studies, but also more your lived experience, Southern Bastards.
Right,
Um, very much that set in the South, but again, kind of those characters who I think grab you in right away. Lots of intergenerational trauma, like not to
right.
project all these therapy themes on it, but for me, when I'm reading stuff like that, it's like, oh yeah, like that. What an interesting story, looking at some of the things that are passed down from family to family, and some of the things that draw you back, even if it's not a pleasant experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could poke around and see intergenerational trauma in so many things I've written. I think that's a
Well, and
part of Thor. That's
yeah, with
it's a big
I think
part of
with the
Star
three,
Wars, right? Like it's
yeah,
it's there
the three
everything.
versions of Thor too, like it's really fascinating to look at when you have
Right,
those kind of past, present, future versions. Yeah, you can see what gets passed down. Um,
right.
but
He's
yeah, so
intergenerational just in and of himself, right? Like,
himself. Yeah. Um,
um, but yeah, and I think that's a big part of kind of the two big Southern stories I've done: Southern Bastards and Men of Wrath, which was a mini series I did with Ron Garney, which is very much about a generational cycle of violence passed down from father to son within the same family. And that was influenced by my real life family history, to where my great great grandfather um, stabbed a guy to death in an argument over some sheep, and then his son was also there and was jailed for a time, and then he later died of rabies after a dog bite. So those two, pieces of family history kind of influenced
Mhm.
the story of the Wrath family and Men of Wrath, and yeah, so Southern Bastard's similar, and it's sort of, and there it's also really about this kind of tug of war between the old South and the new South, and which I think something everybody who grows up in the South, you're a part of. There's the parts that you love and appreciate about being from there, and then there's the parts that you know not so much, that make you cringe, whether the parts from the days past or the ones that are lingering still. So there's always that kind of love hate relationship, and with Southern Bastards, you kind of see that play out again with this sort of family cycle of the guy who comes back to the small town where he was born, where he lived under the shadow of his father, who was like a Buford Pusser kind of figure, a
Mhm.
walking tall kind of stick-toting sheriff who kept the peace back in the day, and then we his son Earl Tubb kind of gets embroiled in what's going on in the small town these days, where the local high school football coach, who's basically the high school version of Nick Saban, the guy who walks on water, who's God to the people in this town because he's been so good for so long. Turns out he's also the local crime boss,
Yeah.
um, and we see these two forces butt heads, and it kind of plays out from there. There are some surprises along the way in Southern Bastards if you haven't read it.
Yeah. Um, he's literally Coach Boss, right? That's
Right.
um, it, part of the work that I've done in my career. I worked in higher ed, coaching sports and mental health for student athletes. One of the of all the comics I've read of H.P. Lovecraft and horror and all these other things, one of the
Mhm.
panels that sticks with me the most is in Coach Boss, when he's still a player, the hazing that he goes through from some of the older players, and how like they were trying to get him to quit the team, and that just sticks with me growing up around sports, being an athlete and then being a coach. Like that's I don't know, horrific in a different way than like Galactus coming and tearing apart something. Like that
Sure.
huge horror is horrific in one way, but then like kind of this, here's a small trauma that no one else knows about except for the person who's carrying it, and yet it's kind of a formative thing in their life.
Yeah, and that story is true. That's a story someone told me at some point that happened to them,
Hmm.
in terms of Coach Boss's hazing. Um, yeah, I mean, Southern Bastards is like I said, my love hate letter to the South, and there's so much of it that's big and sort of blown up and heightened and meant to be kind of pulpy, but there's a lot of it that's really, I think me writing some of my most personal stuff about stories about where I'm from, where I grew up, the place that kind of made me who I am to a huge
Hmm.
degree, in all sorts of good and bad ways.
Yeah. And the church is there in Southern Bastards obviously as well too. Boone is on a mission from God, one of the things that I loved with some of the realism there is working with people who come out of cults. Like there was um, one of those churches that brings in snakes, and you see people with hands that are mangled and some of those things, and
Right.
they're still going to church. So it's just those little things of like, oh yeah, that is, I mean, that's the real experience.
Yes. Yeah. I think, I live in Kansas City these days. I moved to Kansas City like 20 years ago. So I think, um, it's not like I've moved to a bastion of liberal thinking, but compared to where I grew up, it pretty much is. So people, the number of times I've heard over the years since I lived here, when I talk about being from Alabama and growing up in the church, everyone assumes that we handled snakes. I guess they think everyone at every church in the
Sure.
deep South, we all handle snakes and drink poison. Never handled any snakes. We didn't have to do snake handling in my church.
Mhm.
Um, but when I was going to UAB, one of my teachers was Dennis Covington, who had written a book called Salvation on Sand Mountain, which was about exploring snake handling church. And he, um, went to a lot of the services, hung out with a lot of those people, and then actually did it himself at some point. And the book's just about his journey through that. So it's, um, I always liked that idea. And Boone is in the book. Boone's kind of like the redneck version of the Punisher, like he is
Mhm.
this,
Yeah.
which I think you always know guys like that, this sort of backwoods guy who's um, maybe buried some bodies over the years, but he's not the guy who's going to go around and brag about it. And if he did, he's never going to tell. He's going to die without having told anybody. And you figure if he did bury some bodies, they were people who had it coming. They didn't. They
Yeah.
earned their. In his eyes, they had earned their way. So he's the guy who's kind of keeping the peace, so to speak. And yeah, I think um, the would only scratch the surface of kind of exploring the ideas of faith and church and small southern towns. That's what I've done so far in Southern Bastards, and definitely need to see more of that.
Yeah. And the faith in the church, and also the faith in the football coach.
Right, and it's a question as to which one is bigger, at any given moment.
Depends on if it's Saturday or Sunday, right?
Right. I mean, they are definitely both of vital importance.
Yeah. And you're a big Alabama fan still to this day, correct? Alabama football?
I am, yeah, yeah. I grew up a Crimson Tide fan my whole life. I did go to school there for a bit, but like I said, didn't love it and dropped out.
Sure.
We did
I'm
win
a
we won the national championship in '92 when I was there, so that was great.
yeah, I'm a big believer, undergrad, grad school, post grad, like you get to claim your alma mater when it suits you. So Marquette
Right,
basketball does good. I'm like, yeah, Marquette, I went there even though I hated it and didn't like it, and it was just for grad school, but like, hey, if they do good, I'm going to claim that.
right, exactly. I paid
So,
enough money. I get to
right.
claim it.
Yes, exactly. Um to moving to a bit of a different trauma. Not that all your I don't know. I have a hard time talking about comic books without tying it to trauma because it's I don't know. There's very few comics or superheroes who don't have a traumatic backstory. Um, but
Sure.
once
Well,
upon a time,
I mean, that's good drama, right? Like
that's
good story
yeah,
grist.
that's the storytelling. Yeah, once upon a time at the end of the world is this love story that occurs at the apocalypse.
Right. It's my new book for Boom. First time I've worked with Boom. It's coming out right now. We're in the nearing the end of the second arc.
Mhm.
So I think issue 9 just came out. It'll be 15 issues by the time it's done, 3 arcs. And yeah, the first arc we meet these two kids meet each other in the post-apocalyptic wasteland, and it's very much a love story, a story of romance, of like opposites meet and go on an adventure together and kind of fall for each other along the way. I thought of it, it's like if Wes Anderson directed Road Warrior. That's kind of the vibe I was going for
Yeah,
with that first arc. But even within the midst of that story of them kind of falling for each other, you get flashes forward in time, and you get the idea that okay, this is not going to stay like cute forever. So the second arc completely shifts gears from the first arc, and it turns into the story of these characters as adults. They're not kids anymore. They're grown up. They're married. They're exploring, their emotional and sexual relationship with each other. Then that starts to involve other people that they meet along the way, and that turns into them trying to build this community, out of the ruins of the old world. A place that's kind of built on ideas of free love and polyamory and self-expression, and where anyone is free to kind of walk any path they choose. Um, and that's really great and beautiful for a while, but then things start to go wrong and cracks start to form in the ground, figuratively and literally. Um, and it kind of turns into a horror story. As at the heart of it, you have the same two characters, Maceo and Mezzi, the characters we met as kids, and it's their relationship is starting to show cracks, and to me that um, this whole thing is like a love story and a story of um, you know really divorce, and how do you move on from ruin.
Hmm.
um, so you kind of know from the beginning, like, okay, well, this it's not all going to be happily ever after for these
Yeah.
characters, right? So
And I think it's Nick Dragotta is writing that forward, that future version of them where they're clearly not
right,
okay
yeah,
anymore.
Nick's drawing the third. Yeah, we had Alexander Tafinki did the first arc, who he did the Good Asian from a couple years ago, which was really amazing. And then Leila Del Duca is drawing the current arc, the it's called The Rise and Fall of Golganuza. And then Nick draws the future stuff. But the current one that's coming out now is the whole book has been difficult and challenging for me to write. In particular, this arc was challenging, and that I was trying to capture just that feeling of when you're in a relationship and it starts to break down and fall apart. It can feel like you're in the middle of a horror story, right? Where you
Yeah.
just everything hurts in ways it didn't before. Everything it feels like you're on strange footing. Like the ground is shifted beneath your feet. This person that you thought you knew better than anyone, you start to not recognize in ways, and you get to where it's like you're not speaking the same language anymore. So I wanted to see that in literal terms, like take
Hmm.
that, make it a horror story. Um, and within an arc that also explores ideas of polyamory in um, what I hope come across as positive, nuanced terms, outside of the horror story aspect. So I think balancing all those things felt like a really intimidating challenge, and I'd never done anything like this, never read anything like this. Um, Layla was a huge help on this arc and everything that she brought to the story. So I'm really proud of how it's come together.
Hmm.
And I think Layla does some of her best work on these last couple issues. And then we'll jump right into the third arc, where we skip forward in time, and these characters are both old and they've kind of gone their separate ways, and then they're brought back together,
Yeah.
to try to save the planet.
Yeah, I have the first trade, and I'm very excited to see where it goes. I'm a little bit behind, but as a marriage therapist, there's so much stuff in there that's like that falling in love, and then we're getting these slight glimpses flashing forward to know that there's not a happy ending. And when I work with couples, they're coming in. It's better now than when I started my career, 14, 15 years ago, but where people aren't waiting so long to go to therapy. But when I started, like I was taught couples come to therapy 6 or 7 years after they need to. And so like
Sure, right.
there's this calcification, I think, that happens of behaviors where that ships passing the night becomes like this huge disconnect. And it's
That's a
very,
great way to put it. Yeah.
I see, I was reading this and being like, oh man, like that's such a, yep, that's how it goes. Yep, that's how it goes.
Well,
And
it's
I've seen,
when I say um, the book doesn't have a happy ending, you'll have to wait to see what the ending actually is. It clearly doesn't go without some bumps along the way, right?
Sure.
And it's a story of, I mean, I think now at this point in my life, I'm looking around at my friends who are divorced. I'm divorced. Like a lot of people I know are divorced, especially after these last few years.
Yeah.
And I got divorced in the midst of COVID, which is kind of where this came from. The idea of kind of going through that in the midst of what seems like the world is, literally ending.
Mhm.
Um, and then it becomes, that just because you're divorced, that relationship still carries on, and it's especially if you have kids, and it's like, well, what does that look like? And you look at the different versions of that among the people I know, and there's really stark differences. But that's an ongoing question, an ongoing challenge for a lot of people is how do you work that out,
Mhm.
for the best of everybody involved, especially your kids. So I think that's really what the third arc of the book is about in my mind, is that. So
Yeah.
doesn't mean it can't have what you would say a happy ending. It's just
Sure.
it's not, maybe not the happy ending of people, people riding
Well,
off into the sunset together.
yeah, and I'm excited. I'm excited to see where it goes. I like mental health and I like comic books, so it's right there for me. But it's also, um, you know, depictions of things like polyamory, like deconstructing some of those ideas of monogamy and its role in relationships. Like I think having that stuff again in pop culture or shown, like those are things that I see in my office all the time. Those are things that I work with. Dealing with something like suicide is a normal Tuesday for me, but they're still very taboo topics in the culture at large. So it's so fun. It's so exciting to see some of these things put out there by artists and creators who are taking different looks at it.
Well, good, good. And the suicide issue is coming, so you'll get more into that when it will
Sure.
come.
Oh,
So I mean, yes, everything you just said is why this book has been such a challenge to write. If I gonna sit down and write 100 issues of Thor, okay, well, I can go read a few Thor comics and do my research in the North mythology, and cool, I'm good. And
yeah.
it's easy to figure out when you're writing all this and trying to balance all this stuff and do it in a story that changes dramatically. It's not just the art teams that change over the course of these arc, but the story goes in different directions, and it's kind of multiple genres wrapped up into one, as the relationship is, right? Like a relationship in real life is never just the romantic comedy, right? Like
Right.
that's part of it, but that's one act,
Yeah. That's
of
the
the
opening
overall
act.
right. You're gonna, regardless of of whether you stay together, you get divorced, you're together for 50 years, you're definitely going to have different genres over the course of that story, right?
Yeah.
You're going to have the comedy, the the sexual drama, the horror story. You're going to get all that in the midst of it. So I wanted to do a story that spoke to that. Like this is a love story played out over the course of years and years, against the backdrop of the end of time. So
Mhm.
it's maybe the Earth's last great love story, right? Um, so that's the challenge, to sort of to juggle all that stuff, and again to do it in a way that feels respectful and nuanced, and doesn't feel like I'm uh, presenting polyamory in a negative light, but also don't want it to seem like I'm writing a treatise on non-monogamy, or
Right.
a recommendation that everyone who reads this book should try non-monogamy. Like it's a balancing act, and hopefully I feel good about what we've done on that, and hopefully ultimately it's up for readers to read it and to parse it out for themselves.
Yeah. Well, and there's connections. It's I don't know, unfair is maybe the wrong word. I binge read most of your work, so then I saw all these themes that have been spread out over your career, but I read it in like 2 months. Um, but seeing some of that stuff in your run on Thor too, you're not preachy about, hey, like you shouldn't believe in gods. Like it is for the reader to still kind of approach it and bring their meaning making to it, and then make meaning after they've read it. So there are some things that I liked in Once Upon a Time at the End of the World that I wrote down, that, the Wasteland Rangers are a very, I don't know if you meant it as a satire of certain groups, but like they're a scout troop that's kind of authoritarian. I would say they view progress and diversity as the end of the world. Like that's what caused the
Right.
apocalypse from their perspective. So, there's, I don't know if that's, I don't want to ascribe an intention, but as somebody who works with religious trauma, I'm seeing Boy Scouts of America, I'm seeing the Catholic Church, I'm seeing some of these authoritarian groups that are very, this is the only way, type fundamentalist thinking.
Sure. Yeah, I don't think you have to look too hard to find, language like what I ascribed to them in the book. And at first I didn't. I knew I wanted to do the Wasteland Rangers, and I liked the idea of these road warrior Boy Scouts, and I had fun exploring, like, what are their badges? What badges do they have to earn, and all that sort of stuff. But I didn't know, like, what is their angle and what is their philosophy and what drives them. And then I kind of, part of it, I knew they'd sort of be like, the descendants of preppers.
Yeah, the
But
first prepper, right?
right. But beyond that, I didn't. It took me a while to kind of hit up on that, and then it kind of, those ideas, sort of in the same way as, the words and thoughts of Gore echoed throughout 100 issues of my Thor run, even long after he had stopped being a part of the book. The thoughts and philosophies of the Wasteland Rangers will continue to echo back into the book as we go forward, and specifically that idea of, like, of what you're saying is, like, what was it that destroyed the world?
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to keep reading it as it comes out. Like I said, I'm a trade paperback person, so I got to wait for the collected edition to come out.
Well, I think, the second trade should be. I mean, the last issue, the second arc comes out next month, so I think the second trade will be out pretty quickly after that.
Yeah. I think it's. Don't quote me. I think it's November, but
I'm going to quote you.
Shifting gears a little bit. I follow you on Instagram, and I see some posts about pro wrestling every once in a while.
Yeah.
So tell me about your fandom of pro wrestling.
Well, I watched wrestling as a kid, like back in the heyday of the when it was still the WWF, like the Rock and Wrestling, Hulk Hogan and Superfly Snuka and Roddy Piper. I watched her in those days in, like, the local wrestling, so I'd get the Road Warriors and Ric Flair.
Yeah.
And then I stopped. So I didn't watch wrestling for basically the entire career of the Undertaker. Which he had a long career.
Yeah, 30
but
years.
He sort of started right after I stopped, and then the Rock, Stone Cold Steve Austin, didn't watch any of that stuff, the Attitude Era. I remember my boss at the barbecue restaurant I worked at in Alabama would quote, I realize now, he was quoting The Rock to me all the time, and I had no idea what the hell he was talking about. I just thought he was being a jerk. So I missed all that stuff, but then my kid, my son, started watching. I think he watched an Undertaker match on YouTube and liked it, and I told him, like, well, there's, like, wrestling still comes on, right? I think, like, we could watch new ones. So we started watching together as a thing, we could watch and enjoy together. And he's remained somewhat of a fan. I've if anything, become a much bigger fan as it's gone on, and that turned into, we started watching WWE, and that turned into me watching New Japan and Lucha Underground when that was around, and then AEW. And so I've gotten into all that stuff. So now I love it. Now the only problem is that there's too much wrestling to watch week to week, and that there's so many so many shows.
There is a lot on. I joked, my wife's been making sure I don't fanboy too much in getting to talk to you. But I joked, I was like, I'm gonna sneak a Lucha Underground reference in and see if he
Oh
catches
yeah,
it, because then I'll lose my mind.
I
Yeah, that
loved
was,
Lucha Underground.
yeah,
It was
same.
so like I loved how just the combination of just how ridiculous it was at times with like the vignettes and the storyline they would weave.
Yep,
There would be superpowers and there were murders and there were all kind of things happening.
yeah.
I
There was this
loved it. And then
ancient
the
Aztec tribes, like their
right,
magical items. Yeah.
yes. But then and then the wrestling itself would be so good. They had so many
Mhm.
great wrestlers go through that show. I mean, so many of the people that I'm still loving, now. Um, so yeah, I have huge fondness for Lucha Underground.
Yeah. And wrestling, I defend it, when it's done well, which it is not always, but when it's done well, it's just storytelling. It's not a wrestling show. It's a drama around a wrestling company.
Right. When it's done well, I mean, I don't know anything that kind of hits all the same buttons that it can hit, right?
Mhm.
Because it's like, I mean, it's like a soap opera that you watch every week. It's also just an athletic competition in the midst of that. It's pre-planned and scripted, so when they build the drama and have a payoff, it can be really profound because it's also live. You're watching it happen live, and then
Right.
you know the, the like when they do a pay-per-view on Sunday, they can have a show on Monday and follow up to that,
Mhm.
and also incorporate people's reactions to that. So it's also storytelling where they can change and adjust like on the fly, right?
Yeah.
It's such a weird thing where I don't know anything else that kind of can hit all those buttons. And also
Yeah.
sometimes I just like to watch these, the people in the amazing stuff that they can do, amazing
Right.
or horrible stuff they do to each other in the ring.
Yeah. Well, and I've come from a big sports family, so I love, I've been to games, I've been to Milwaukee Bucks games, I've seen Giannis play, I've seen Aaron Rodgers in his prime play, where the whole 70,000
Cool.
people are chanting MVP. And like wrestling just leans so far into, here's the fan interaction, here are the things to yell, here's theme music that you could get excited when it
Oh yeah,
plays. Like it's such an experience.
absolutely. I would say with wrestling, sometimes too much, sometimes to the detriment of the product.
Yeah.
When the fans can be a little too involved or a little too, can just sort of take over. Um, but I love it. I've been to a lot of good WWE shows. I was there. I took my kid. We saw Undertaker and Brock Lesnar when they had a big one of those like you know um, brawls where everybody empties out of the back and you got
Yeah.
40 people in the ring trying to pull them apart. We were there the night Becky Lynch and the women from SmackDown invaded, and she's got her nose busted open, and there's blood
Right.
pouring down her face. So
Yep.
we got to see some cool shows, and I've been to see AEW. I'm last time they were in town, I missed it, but before that, I got to see that Kenny Omega Pac Iron Man match, which was amazing.
Nice. Kenny
Yeah.
Omega is both my boys. I have a 5 and a 2-year-old, and they both love, love, love Kenny
Oh
Omega
yeah.
because they know how much
He's
I
so
like him.
good. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's so amazing. Yeah. I mean, I think it was the Young Bucks and Kenny that got me watching, New Japan when I first started. I think the first time I saw the Young Bucks, I was like, "What? Who are these guys?" And from that, like, subscribed to the New Japan streaming network. Um, but yeah, I'm a
Yeah.
huge AEW nerd these days.
Yeah, me too. I was in Milwaukee when Kota Ibushi, or not Kota Ibushi, Kazuchika Okada came out before the first Forbidden Door, and I was like,
Oh, cool.
that was a bucket list I didn't know I had, because he wrestles in Japan all the time. So I never
Right.
even had that on my radar of like, I'll get to see Okada live. And then
Sure.
yeah, so
Sure.
I'm the same way with, I'll talk about, Lucha Underground, or I'll talk about New Japan, and everyone's like, I meant like John Cena. And I was like, oh, sorry, I'm aware of that, but that's not what I'm talking about.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, there's a huge, wrestling comic book crossover. I feel like certainly more than there is like comic book crossover with sports in general. I feel
Yeah.
it's not that big. I think I know most everybody within comics who watches football. Like we all kind of
Hmm.
find each other. But man, yeah, there's a big crossover with wrestling, and a lot of the wrestlers are big comic nerds, and
Yep.
um,
Collectors too. Yeah.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
how many times have we seen wrestlers come out to the ring the last few years, basically looking like comic book characters? I think
Yep.
Jade Cargill she's dressed like comic characters a few times. Johnny
Hmm.
Gargano, Rey
Yeah.
Mysterio,
Rey
he was
Mysterio's
straight
done
up
it for years.
Wolverine. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of overlap there. And again, I think a lot of it just goes back to like different ways to tell good stories. Like that's what it is.
right. Which to me is like I love. I mean, if that's a football game, I love figuring out like what is the story of this game. Right.
Mhm.
It's not just 22 dudes running into each other for 3 hours. It is that, but also there's a story that's developing of
Yeah.
who's going to be the hero, who's going to be the goat by the end of this. Like, what are the few pivotal beats that are going to really decide? And if one of them ball bounces a different way in this one moment, you've got a completely different story that comes out of it. Like,
Right.
I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I could nerd out talking about either of those for a long time. Um, Shifting just a touch back, how do you kind of handle as a creator and as somebody who's, you've had stories that have gone into the MCU now. You've had a lot of, I would say, you won an Eisner, so like that's a pretty exclusive club. How do you handle pushback from fans or online trolls or people who are like, how do you do this work that's maybe taxing on you mentally and from a creative perspective, and then have that maybe negativity coming back your way?
I mean, I don't, I think generally I've never let it bother me. I mean, it probably did more in the early days when I think any comic book creator, when you first start, you're intrigued by any feedback you get, right? Or just anytime people notice you and are reading your stories. And so then the first time you start getting negative feedback, I think everybody has the impulse to, well, I should go into that message board and talk to these people and answer their questions, which I've quickly figured out like, well, I think that's not a healthy pursuit. That's not,
Sure.
doesn't generate fruitful conversations. So I kind of, for the most part, just haven't cared, and definitely noticed things like when I was doing Thor, certainly took note of a lot of the negative response to that, and incorporated some of it into the book itself, which I
Yeah.
delighted in doing. Um, but I mean, I don't think any writer you can ever write things based on what people are saying on social media or what you see online. Like you have to be true to whatever story you're telling, and I've certainly never changed
Yeah.
or shaped the story based on what other people are saying. You have to do what feels right to you, and my job is pretty simple in that I write stories for myself, and then I get approval from if I'm working with Marvel or DC, it's still a small number of people who have to sign off on what I'm doing. Is the artist who's drawing it, are they having a good time? Are they happy with it?
Hmm.
Um, because at the end of the day, that's it. That's all I control, right? I mean, beyond that, yeah, you want retailers to like it and be happy and excited about it and push it to fans, and you want fans to buy it and enjoy it because that all means you get to have a career and continue doing it. But I don't know how to control those parts of it, right? I don't know how to write a book that retailers want or that fans want. I just know how to do what I want, and then it kind of goes from there. But I can't control those other parts of it. I just have to do the things that speak to me.
Yeah. Control your controllables is one of my many therapy mantras that I give to people often.
Now, I will say in terms of like people saying mean things on the internet. I mean, it's definitely been different like the last 3 years. I mean, I think some of it is just as the tide of social media has continued. It feels like the fandom kind of getting darker and
Hmm.
angrier in some respect. But also, I think as we were, in terms of comics, as the comic convention circuit shut down and nobody was leaving their house, there's always a big difference between just if you take what you see online as reality and you're cut off from the real
Yeah.
from reality itself, then you kind of have no choice but to feel like, oh well, I guess this is the general opinion. So you forget, like it was once I started going to conventions again and doing appearances again, I kind of didn't realize like how much I had missed it. I always enjoyed going to shows and seeing people and getting to travel, but I don't think I'd realized kind of the important part it played, where it is nice to just go meet people who are actually reading and enjoying what you're doing, like face to face, and chat with them. And you're like, oh yeah, I forget that, you know, those are not the people who are necessarily the loudest on Twitter.
Right.
Um,
Hmm.
so you have to like get out into the real world and be reminded, oh yeah, like this stuff is actually finding people and connecting with them.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. What do you do for kind of like, I don't know, I'm making an assumption here. The word that came to mind was detoxing, but when you're writing some of the heavier stuff or some of the darker stuff, is there a process that you have to kind of reset? Or for you, is it like that's just what you do telling a story and it doesn't really affect you?
I mean, I don't think it affects me. I mean, like I said, the Once Upon a Time book was hard just because it
Hmm.
felt, much more personal in so many ways. But I think in general, writing something that's really dark is not the process and stuff I go through is no different than if I'm writing something that's silly. I mean, it all kind of makes me smile and makes me happy. I mean, I'm the guy,
Sure.
who laughs at inappropriate moments in movies just because this makes me happy. Oh, is this a
Yeah.
moment that scares me or disturbs me? But if I have that feeling, I just it quickly turns into joy because I'm excited that, oh man, like you just freaked me out, right, with what you
Yeah.
did. Like, bravo. So that makes me laugh. So I think I'm like that in writing too. Like even I can go to dark places, and when I feel like I get what I wanted, get the right moment, it makes me happy.
Yeah.
Um, but I think in general, the thing I do to like detox or just kind of turn work off, because it's hard. You're pretty much always working in some capacity, and that there's always, I always think of it as like a kitchen, and just the stuff is always simmering away
Sure.
on the stovetop, right? And sometimes you move ones to the front, and sometimes you put ones in the back, and those need to like cook a little bit longer. But stuff's always simmering away, and things are always churning, and sometimes some of my stuff I like the most will pop up out of the
Hmm.
blue when I've still been thinking about it for 3 weeks, and then just in a moment where I'm taking a shower or driving somewhere and not thinking about it, suddenly pieces fit together. So I
Yeah.
think that's always happening. But when I have moments where like I'm taking a walk or something and I just want to not think about work, I listen to Disney theme park podcasts are pretty much my
Okay.
my go-to.
Sure.
So
Um,
pretty much all the decent Disney theme park podcasts I subscribe to and just switch from one to the other.
and that's just new things opening. I don't know what a Disney theme park podcast entails.
Just the ins and outs of going. I mean, I love going to Disney theme parks, so it's just
Sure.
the ins and outs of what to do, what not to do, restaurant reviews, hotel reviews,
Yeah.
stories about the history of the park, all that kind of stuff. I'm there for all of it.
Yeah. That's
And
awesome.
sometimes I'll throw like a couple of them have YouTube channels too that I subscribe to, so I'll throw a video on like while I'm cooking,
Yeah.
or something. But then
Yeah.
sometimes it's like, no, I'm not able to pay enough attention to this, and I really want to know what their 35 things are that you should definitely do it. Disney's Animal Kingdom, so I'm going to save this for when I'm not focused on cooking dinner.
Right. Yeah, that's fantastic. One more out of the not totally out of the blue, but you and I both have aggressive facial hair. What's the beard routine? How'd you get there?
Is that correct? Is that how you define it?
I was gonna say voluptuous, but I felt bad about it.
Yeah, yours is lovely, and you'll have all the hair to go with it too. I wish I could pull that part off, but
Sure,
I've been bald, I think, for as long as I've been atheist now. Like I shaved my head
sure. I
in
tell people
1994.
I grow it out for the people who can't, and that's true because I grow it out for like 3 years and then I'll donate it for
Oh,
kids
that's
with
cool.
cancer. So
Oh,
yeah.
that's good. So wait, what was the question? Just
What's the beard routine? I'm guessing you get asked this question. People always ask me how I got my beard to be this long.
Yeah, I don't. Is there a secret to that? To me, I've always just said like, well, you just don't care. You just don't cut
Hey,
it. You know.
when in
Um,
doubt, grow it out, right?
right. I mean, I don't. I just years ago I hit a point where I was like, I mean, I'd always hated to shave and always, I've had a beard and all the times when I could, when I wasn't working a job where I had to shave, I always had
Sure.
some kind of facial hair. So at some point when I was writing comics, I just had an epiphany where I was like, wait a minute, like if I have to go in for a job interview at some point, like I have seriously screwed up my life. So I think I just don't have to care anymore. Like I'm gonna get tattoos and grow my beard
Yeah.
out, and
Yeah.
I did, and it was when I first time I grew it out, it got pretty unruly. Like I was just kind of clueless. I didn't know like what do I do? How do you manage this? I
Yeah.
hadn't had hair in that point for years, so I was not used to putting a lot of work into it. So at some point, I got tired of it and shaved it off, and then instantly regretted that and threw it back.
Yeah.
So now, I go in and get it trimmed up and shaped up at a place every once in a while, and
Yeah.
have various beard oils and balms and
Yep.
shampoos
Yeah.
and
I tell people
all sorts of products.
I wash it and I have to straighten it when it gets this long. It gets a little curly sometimes, but that's not a everyday process. And yeah, sometimes sea
Yeah,
salt spray. Sometimes you got to soften it. Sometimes
oh
you
yeah,
gotta whatever.
mine is always really curly.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, most days I don't leave the house except to maybe go to the grocery store. So
Sure.
um, I don't have to interact with the public too often.
Yeah. I have to try and look nice, or people won't listen to anything I have to say in therapy. It seems
Sure,
to be I have to
sure.
be somewhat presentable.
I luckily don't. I'm wearing sweatpants right now.
Sure. We're both wearing Star Wars shirts too, I noticed.
Oh yes,
Jason, this has been awesome. Thanks so much for taking the time. I have a list of therapists to get on podcasts, and I have a list of non-therapists, shots in the dark, kind of a magical wish list of mine. So I was super stoked to be able to get in touch, and that you were like, yeah, let's talk about religious trauma and intergenerational trauma and all that stuff. Let's do it. So thanks
no,
so much for coming on.
I mean, when you messaged me, you rattled off a list of things we could talk about. They were all clearly right up my alley. So I think
Yeah,
I think we were meant for each other, Jeremy. I'm glad we could make
yeah.
it happen.
For sure. Other than the comic book shop, where can people find your work if they want to learn about what's coming up or what you got going on?
Well, I'm on Instagram and Threads and Twitter and such as you said, but for the most part, the best way to keep up with me is I have a Substack newsletter. So if you just look for Jason Aaron on Substack, I'm on there, and I don't post every week or anything. You maybe get one once a month, but that's the best way to kind of know what new stuff do I have coming out, where am I going to be, well, what am I up to, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that's how I knew about the Batman Off-World announcement. So
Cool.
that's how people should check it
Well,
out and follow that
and
stuff along.
I will have, my Marvel exclusive was up late last year, so far this year I've been working on a lot of brand new things. So you'll start to hear about the next ones of those coming up in a few weeks, I think, with
Ooh,
with even more to be announced
yeah, very
as
cool.
the months go by.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on. This has been really awesome.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
And to all the lovely listeners out there, thanks for tuning in. We'll have all of Jason's links in the show notes, and you can find all my info at wellnesswithjared.com. Everybody will be back next week with another new episode. Take care.